right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker, and today's special episode. So this is going to be the last of my new episodes for Real Seekers before I start up school in September. And this was an episode I was invited on to Skeptics and Seekers, David Johnson's show, as part of a series of shows on morality and the moral argument for God and that sort of thing. So I was episode 2, discussing with the internet atheist Vaal on the issue of moral ontology and how that makes sense. You know, things like normative ethical theories were kind of hinted at a bit there, especially deontology and virtue ethics, but a little bit on utilitarianism as well. So yeah, it was a great show. Val was a great guest, so it was a very great conversation. I hope you guys enjoy it. I'm posting it up here. But yeah, just so you know, even though I will be slowing down in terms of new content, at least in the immediate vicinity. Once I start up school and sort of getting familiar with what's the workload like there, how much spare time do I have to devote to doing new podcasts. But the good news for you guys, if you're new to Real Seeker Ministries and you haven't, if you're not a carryover from the SNS, I've got a whole archive of past episodes so I'll still keep posting up episodes every 1 to 2 weeks that are new for you guys from the SNS archive there. As well, I will keep doing new shows once in a while. So I'm going to keep doing my solo shows, finish off the cosmological argument, and then go into other arguments for the existence of God. I also have a couple leftover guest shows. So Mike Lacona will be coming on in January to discuss the evidence for the resurrection. I've also got Dr. Bruce Grayson and hopefully Gary Habermas as well to discuss near-death experiences. For one of my, a Muslim listener reached out to me, Omar, and he was asking me to invite a Muslim guest to kind of counter the show we had with Louis Dizon on Islam. So I've reached out to Dr. Shabir Ali, and hopefully he'll be kind enough to get back to me and want to come on at some point. I'm in talks with Lydia McGrew about a certain show. So there will be definitely some new projects that I'll be working on for you guys. So pay attention if you're an old SNS follower. Pay attention. You'll occasionally see a new thing coming in, at least until I get familiar with my schedule and how to balance podcasting alongside the masters and the job as a TA and everything like that. There will be new stuff, and as I said, I will make sure to post every 1 to 2 weeks. I will post a show from our old SNS archive, so there will be something for people who subscribe there. So, all right, with that said, have a great day. I hope you guys enjoy this show on Moral Ontology between me and Val. All right, take care.
Another exciting episode of Skeptics and Seekers. I'm your host, David the Skeptic, and I'm joined by two champions in the arena. We have on my left hand Dale Glover, and on my right, Vaal, the false god. Why would you want to call yourself that? Anyway, we have these two, and I've been looking forward to this. I have this as one of my moderating duties for the podcast extravaganza that we are going through. And mostly the reason I wanted this one as moderating duties is just to be ringside with Dale and Val. Eat your hearts out, kids. So this is a continuation of the moral debate that Marvin and I started a couple of weeks ago. And we knew going in that we would never be able to really cover this topic. There would be no way, even if we went for 5 hours, that we'd be able to cover this topic. And so I began to cook up a scheme so that we could actually cover this topic, or at least address it. And the way we're doing that is we're doing 5 more podcasts on morality. So count myself and Dale, our first one, as one, and on that same page you will see these other 5 podcasts show up. Today we have Dale and Val discussing Moral Ontology. I think this is the Christian's favorite part of the moral argument. Next week, we have David Robinson with yours truly discussing moral epistemology. That is my favorite aspect of the moral argument. And then the next episode, by the way, that this one will come out today as you're hearing it. The next one with myself and David Russell, will be coming out Saturday. I believe Sunday, we will have Teddy and Darren Lute, and they will be discussing the practical aspects of that. And so we will have the philosophical, the grounding of morality, how we know what is and isn't moral, and then we'll have them put that to the test as they discuss the morality of homosexuality. Understand that this show is not really so much about homosexuality. That's more of a heuristic to see how we put the concepts together. So that's going to be fun. The fourth show, which I think will be the following day, Monday the 24th, that will be Darren Lute pulling double duty with Daniel the Preacher, who showed up also in Ask an Atheist Anything recently. I'm not sure if that show is out or not, but it should be by the time you hear him. So that will be fun. And they will be discussing whether morality needs to be grounded in a God or not. Can we have completely natural explanations for morality? So they'll be discussing that. And then the next one will probably be the following weekend. We'll give you a chance to digest all of that. Marvin will come back for the finale, and he will be with Brian with a Y to wrap everything up. And I will show up as a moderator for that one. And who knows what other guests might stop by for the finale. It's going to be great. And so without any further ado, let's step into what I consider in my own mind episode 2 of the moral discussion. Started with myself and Marvin, now Dale, and introducing Val with his opening arguments.
How are you doing, Dale? Nice to meet you over this podcast, and thanks a lot, David.
Nice to meet you as well there, Val.
Okay. And so to kind of set the stage, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see are the sort of the problems inherent in talking about morality, especially what we're going to be discussing today. And it's a little bit of lowering of expectations in a way too. So some of it is going to be kind of obvious, and some of it a little bit of a reiteration of what I started with on the podcast where I appeared talking about hell. But I'll get to the general cautions I have about discussing morality. And so, like, on the last show that I was on with other atheists discussing hell, we argued like typical atheists, and we're confidently declaring why hell is immoral and unjust. And we see this level of confident moral appraisals all the time between theists and atheists, and particularly when discussing the claims of holy texts and their God's actions and their character and stuff. And in fact, we all sort of in normal life feel we can make quite confident appraisals of certain people for their actions being good or bad. So in those normal everyday realms, we tend to sort of speak with a pretty high degree of moral confidence. But this show is different. Even though the subject is morality, I'll be significantly more reserved in the confidence I have and in the arguments here, or either from me or from the other side. Pardon my voice. So why is this? I'd like to make the point with an analogy. And it's an analogy that sort of reiterates the point I started with in the hell discussion show, but it points also to the problems of discussing moral theories. So let's take the analogy to fire. We all share a common agreement on the properties of fire insofar as we encounter it and the reason and the way we reason about it in our daily lives, basically on the human scale at which we encounter fire. So it's a source of heat. We know how it generally acts, its properties and characteristics in a wide variety of situations. It's a source of heat that's a great tool when under control on our stoves, but it's a great threat to us when uncontrolled, burning through our living room, etc. So, on this everyday understanding that we all tend to share, if someone like Fred is stuck in a forest and he's in the cold, it'd be a good idea for Fred to produce a bonfire of some sort, as that will keep him warm and help him survive. So that's a reasonable use of fire. But if there's a heat wave and Fred is trying to cool off, then building a bonfire and throwing himself in is, we'd all recognize, just irrational, given the heating properties of fire. And that actually reminds me of one of my favorite old articles from The Onion, the satirical news magazine, the one with the headline that says, NASA baffled by failure of straw shuttle. So there's like some quotes from it. NASA officials watched in horror Monday as the 68 billion straw space shuttle Explorer 2 burst into flames just after liftoff from Cape Canaveral. Quote, the straw ship was dry, light, and well bailed enough to break the Earth's orbit, but inexplicably burst into flames when ignited with 3,000 gallons of rocket fuel, said NASA's chief engineer, George Tashikama. In all the pre-fueling tests, the straw shuttle procedure went perfectly, but as soon as we ignited it with fuel, it exploded. Why? So the reason everybody gets the joke of that article, of course, is that we all share an acquaintance with the properties of fire, and we recognize how inconsistently the engineers were reasoning in building a shuttle based out of highly flammable straw and igniting it with fire. So our acquaintance with everyday morality is like our acquaintance with fire in that respect. Most of us share some common understanding of the properties of what makes someone good or bad, or their actions good or bad. So as I pointed out on the previous podcast, no one walks out of the movie Star Wars confused about the fact that Darth Vader and the Empire, who destroyed entire planets of people for their own selfish aims, were the bad guys. Or that Luke Skywalker and his friends, who risked their own well-being, the well-being of others, were the good guys. Another example might be if we as parents were deciding on which school to send our children to, and we're trying to figure out which would be a good school with a good principal, we generally share agreement on how we'd evaluate schools and their principals. So if there's a school with a principal who's honest, fair, compassionate, wise, and whose policies preserve the well-being of our children, and which tend to produce well-educated, well-adjusted pupils, well, that would generally be rated a good principal or good school. But if, Fred says, I know of a school with a good principal. In this school, the principal has arranged that the water system often stops working, deadly diseases are sometimes released into the classrooms, venomous snakes are placed in the playground, child abusers are hired as teachers, and the school is constructed so that parts of it occasionally collapse on students and faculty. Now that is a good principal running a good school. So we all recognize that Susan sounds insane here. We'd have no idea what she even means by good anymore. That's not how good and the appraisal of people usually work. So again, we have a common grasp of good and bad, and of the good properties like benevolence, love, justice, etc., similar to how we share an understanding of the properties of fire. So now, on this level, the deeper questions about the deeper characteristics, the ontology of fire, the reality of whatever it's composed of, the ontological basis on which it arose or came to exist, it's neither here nor there. Fire could have arisen from natural physics, or it could have been brought into existence by aliens, or by pixies, or beings from another dimension, or fire could have been the creation of a god. Whatever its provenance and ontology, it's still the case that fire has the properties it does that we recognize and use every day. And from those properties, we can evaluate whether someone is reasoning properly and consistently about how to use or predict the activity of fire. Fire still burns your fingers, it cooks your food, or burns down your house and forests if it gets out of control. It's the same with our everyday understandings of the properties of what makes good and bad people and actions. We don't need a specialist understanding, an ontological theory for how it exists in order to reason about good and bad, given the properties we do understand, or at least apply consistently in our daily lives. So, fire exists, it's one of the entities in our ontology, and we can keep asking questions about the nature of fire. sort of the way in that old Louis C.K. bit, he has his kid endlessly asking him questions why that lead to absurdity. So what's fire comprised of? Well, it's a chemical reaction. So chemicals are part of the ontology. That is what exists. What is the nature of the chemicals? What are they comprised of? Well, they can be broken down to the entities described in physics, atoms, electrons, etc., operating on the laws described by physics. Okay, so what are the nature of those physics? And on down you go through the rabbit hole. And this is where you leave the everyday experience of the layman and laywoman into the realm of experts. This is much like, I guess, philosopher Wilfred Southern's distinction between the manifest image versus the scientific image. So we have in the manifest image as human beings, we have the world of trees and flowers and people and cars and bugs as they seem to manifest themselves to our human perception. And then we have the scientific image of those things, which is populated with molecules, atoms, electrons, gravity, quarks, and maybe other strange entities like strings and dark energy. And in the same way, you can start asking those chains of questions about the nature of morality. And you leave the strata of everyday acquaintance, and you go down the rabbit hole of epistemological and ontological questions that are really hard to answer and which I'm hardly qualified to answer. And the problem is things get really weird in the domain of experts. Once you go down the rabbit hole far enough, you find that some human intuitions become challenged and pushed around. The same physical theories that give you the nature of fire also entail entities and propositions that seem to thwart some of our intuitions. So like you learn in physics, things like objects of different weight actually fall to Earth at the same rate of speed, when you account for air friction, et cetera. So for instance, in a vacuum. It doesn't fit our intuitions that a feather would fall the same rate as a bowling ball in a vacuum, but it happens. Or deeper down, you go into all the counterintuitive stuff like, the reference frame invariance of the speed of light, the limits on how fast anything can travel. Like, why couldn't something accelerate indefinitely? What would stop it? Well, you find out that intuition is wrong. Or all the counterintuitive phenomena in quantum mechanics, or the propositions of almost endless versions of yourself existing in multiple universes. And yet, so it pushes around our intuitions and thwarts some of them, but at the same time, the very reason we can consider many of the counterintuitive suggestions in physics tends to be on the basis of holding on to other intuitions that keep our world coherent. So for instance, if physicists are hanging their hats on the intuitions inherent in their math, for instance, they're not going to let those go. So in drilling down the nature of reality, there seems to be this careful dance in trying to preserve certain intuitions while carefully dispensing with others that we are willing to let go. And this is what you tend to find, I think, in philosophy in general and philosophy of morality in specific. Philosophers appeal to intuition all the time, saying, for instance, that when you can derive conclusions from an argument that seem weird or strange on our intuitions, that's at least some reason to be skeptical of the claim or to reject the theory. And there's, of course, some controversy about the role of intuitions in evaluating theories. Some philosophers will argue against appeal to intuitions, but you just see plenty of it in philosophy, and especially moral philosophy. And so there you have this careful dance in which moral theory is supposed to both describe our moral intuitions and account for those moral intuitions at the same time, where you often show that a theory fails because its logic results not simply in contradictions, but in how it leads to conclusions that violate some moral beliefs we hold that we're just not willing to overturn. And so, it's like in physics, if you go down the rabbit hole, you're going to screw around with your intuition. So if you take some moral theories, if you take like an act utilitarian, he may find that a number of his moral intuitions are grounded in his theory, but he may come to certain intuitions, say about justice or innocence, and other intuitions, they're being undermined. So she may find that her theory proposes that charging an innocent person with a crime results in more happiness or well-being overall, and that fulfills the act utilitarian theory, or that she has to abandon the intuition that her child's life is any more valuable than the lives of her neighbor's 3 children. Those are tough intuitions to give up, but she may have to give up those intuitions to keep the rest of her theory. Or if you get a rule or a duty-based deontologist who may find certain moral intuitions have to be given up, for instance, keeping his duty of never seeking to deceive other rational beings. You've got a classic problem if the deontologists were hiding an innocent Jewish person from the Nazis, And the Nazis asked at the door if he knows where the Jewish person is. Most people have the moral intuition that lying would be the right thing to do to save the Jewish person. But the deontologist may have to give up on that intuition to follow his duty not to lie. Now, of course, deontologists and everybody else will have their rebuttals to this, but these are general. I'm just getting at generals here. The moral subjectivist who thinks that morality is decided by the individual, or the moral constructivist who thinks that morality is constructed by agreement within societies, they might have to give up moral intuitions that some other society is truly objectively wrong and enslaving or torturing people. And you don't avoid this in theism either. It's got its challenges. Christians, for instance, even when they accept their biblical God as the foundation of morality, they often find that his actions are counterintuitive to some of their intuitions. Many, for example, will have a hard time with the concept of hell, or simply in either experiencing just personal tragedy or observing the tragedy for others in the world, their intuitions about what a good person who had the power to ameliorate that tragedy would have done are thwarted. And they wonder, where is God in these cases? And they often have to stuff away the insult to their moral intuition and go on faith that God has good reasons that they don't know yet for what he causes or allows. And even if you're a natural theologian who reasoned from the nature of the world to the existence of a God, insofar as God is good, he still faces the type of insults to his moral intuitions, given the nature of suffering and injustice in the world. So the point is, moral theories are really tough. If there was an easy answer, we'd have it by now. And I get kind of suspicious of people who feel they may have the answer or an easy answer, or who are full of confidence in their particular moral theory. And it seems to me that any moral theory will be doing the stance of trying to both account for and preserve certain goods and intuitions we already acknowledge, while possibly subverting other intuitions. That said, I find certain claims and theories more compelling than others, but we can get into that, and I'll just leave it at that. Sorry for the length.
No problem. Thank you for that opening statement. Dale, your opening statement.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to say thanks again to Val. That was a great opening speech, and I think I actually agree with a lot of what you said there, but I do have a couple questions for you when we get to the rebuttal stage. But in terms of my own opening statement, so when David pitched the topic of moral ontology, the first thing that pops into my head as to what that subject entails is, okay, well, what is the nature of morality, of moral truths themselves, and how do we identify or distinguish moral truths, which can include moral principles, moral duties, values, that kind of thing, from non-moral ones? And on that front, I sort of look at it in terms of there's four criteria that can help us. Now, whether these are a complete package, they're necessary and sufficient criteria in and of themselves, or if I'm missing one, again, I'm a particularist. So I think that we can recognize clear cases of something, even if we don't have a necessary and sufficient checklist. But I do submit these four criteria as ways that I think we can distinguish certain moral truths from non-moral truths. So the first one is that typically moral truths or principles or rules, they're seen as being supremely authoritative, or they're an overriding guide for conduct, attitudes, motives, or thoughts. So some philosophers will say, well, they have the highest degree of incumbency. I agree with saying it this way. There's some controversy with saying it has the highest degree of incumbency that Val sort of hinted at, in terms of, okay, well, are all moral principles equally weighty, or are there times when they conflict? And there are complications there that I'm sure we'll discuss in time when me and Val go back and forth there. The second criterion is that moral truths provide a prescriptive imperative, otherwise sometimes known as a categorical imperative, something that we ought to do. It's not just a mere description. This is sort of related to the ought is problem. The third criterion is that moral truths are universalizable. So they apply equally to all morally relevant similar situations. regardless of time, place, or person. So as long as the morally relevant circumstances are the same, you've got to be consistent there. So this is essentially a way of saying that moral truths don't have exceptions. And the fourth criterion that I've sort of modified here, this is sort of my own, but I just say that moral truths typically have to involve or pertain to at least one or more moral agents. And just as a suggestion, I think that they usually refer to proper moral agent flourishing and well-being and dignity, stuff like that. So what I called personism with David Smalley when he was on our show. So that's sort of how I think we can go about distinguishing moral truths from non-moral truths. And this relates to David's question. So, okay, the second premise of the moral argument, that objective moral truths are exist or something like that. Well, okay, what do Christians typically mean? And corresponding to those four criteria, I think there are three ways that Christians typically will answer what we mean by when we say we're a moral absolutist or an objectivist kind of thing. So the first one is the common one that we hear all the time. So, they're objectively and unchangingly true, irrespective of an individual subject's beliefs, desires, whatever. It's independent of the beliefs in that of individuals and or cultures. So that's the number one thing, and there are five different things under that people can give to describe that. So basically, moral propositions have truth values. They make no reference, and they don't derive from the subjective beliefs of individuals or cultures or species, because I know David's answer to that. There are objectively good or bad arguments for the truth of those moral propositions that are independent of subjective beliefs and desires and that sort of thing of the individual or culture. Another example, when two moral statements conflict, only one of those statements and or neither of those statements can be right. They can't both be correct. So yeah. The second way that what Christians mean when they speak about moral absolutes or moral objective statements and that sort of things is kind of corresponding to what I said before. They are exceptionalists. They are universalizable. So this is a way that this is what Christians mean when they say moral absolutes are, morals are absolute or objective. And the final way is the way that I said in my second point, that they have the highest degree of incumbency, or they're supremely authoritative. So this is kind of saying there are no exemption from the moral truth or moral principle or whatever. Now, this is controversial. So Immanuel Kant, he believed in what was called unqualified absolutism, where you have a moral principle of life versus principle of truth. And they're equally weighty, so you can't just you can't lie to save a life, for example. And most of us see that that's wrong. I mean, it's obviously what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to lie and save that life, from that Jewish life from the Nazi or that sort of thing. So just to qualify, when I say it, first of all, when I say it has moral truths have the highest degree of incumbency, I'm talking about with respect to non-moral propositions and that sort of thing only. They are higher than non-moral propositions. That's not necessarily to say that they all have the highest degree of incumbency with respect to other moral truths, because sometimes in the moral hierarchy, moral principles will conflict, and you have to choose the lesser of two evils, which is a conflicting absolutism, or the greater of two goods, which is known as graded absolutism. And when we do this, we're saying that the principle still applies. It's not an exception, right? Because moral principles are exceptionalists or universalizable, but there can be exemptions from that principle, where the principle still makes itself felt, but you have no choice but to exempt it temporarily. So those are the three things that I think Christians have to answer David's question when they're talking about, well, what do you mean by a moral absolute or objective morals? So yeah, I think the next thing to say quickly is, okay, well, how can one argue that there are these objective moral truths or moral absolutes, or as I prefer to say, necessary moral truths? So the first one is Val kind of covered this, and it's through moral intuitions, properly basic beliefs. This is what I've presented on the show multiple times, and I think it's quite strong that these objective moral principles do in fact exist. And it would take something very strong to counter that, or to get me to not believe that morals are objective or necessary truths based on my moral intuitions alone. The second way you can argue for moral absolutes is by proving that they are logically entailed of the truth of a worldview. So let's pretend you can prove Christianity is true, or God exists and has the property of existing a se, or the God's a deity, he's the creator of everything that exists or something. Well, then one could perhaps argue that moral absolutes follow from the truth of that worldview, or that proposition, so that it's in a derivative way. And then the final way is by falsifying ethical relativism or subjectivism, and saying, well, look, there are only these two exhaustive options. Either it's objective or it's subjective. There isn't a third option. And I can falsify that subjectivism or ethical relativism is true. Therefore, by definition, that means moral objectivism is true. So those are the three strategies one can give to try and argue that moral truths are in fact objective. Now, I had stuff about normative ethical theory. So Val's not a utilitarian, so I'm actually going to skip over all of that. And I'll just describe my view quickly. So I'm a deontologist. So I believe, obviously, that there are moral rules, and it's intrinsically good in and of itself to follow these moral rules in the form of principles and moral duties. But I'm also a virtue ethicist. So this, there was actually a quote okay, so yeah, there's a famous quote in ethics where it says, look, virtues without rules are blind. They have no guidance. But moral rules without virtues are motivationally impotent. So I think that both are true in a complementary way, right? So we have these moral rules that guide our actions, and we're motivated to follow these given rules because they develop characters that are fit for our salvation. I'm sort of a classical essentialist there, where I think God designed us to experience this state of deep well-being or bliss, and by following the moral rules, we're able to obtain this beneficial consequence. So yeah, the thing I want to get through here is that there are two fundamental perspectives on normative ethical theory. The first is deontological, so rule-based. Hey, here's the rules, follow it. And then there's also the teleological approaches, which covers things like ethical egoism, utilitarianism, or virtue ethics. And I think that both are needed. You need a deontological foundation and a teleological foundation that complement each other in a circular way, not a viciously circular way. And that's what forms the ultimate foundation of our morals. And my final thing to say, sorry, I'm going on way too long, but so yes, I am a theist. So I ground these moral rules and virtues in the nature of God. And I'm sure we'll get into that later on. So yeah, I'll turn it back to you, David, there.
Okay, thank you for that statement. And I'm going to have you, Dale, go ahead and respond to Val's opening statement. If there's some particular rebuttals that you have, notes that you've taken, now's a good time to express that. And then when you are done, just hand the mic over to Val, and he can do the same for rebuttaling your opening statement. After that, we will get into some fisticuffs.
Okay. All right. So yeah, no outright rebuttals, but just sort of probing questions for you, Val. So I wrote down two fundamental points. So the first is okay. So yes, we shouldn't be confident. I agree with that. Like there should be some epistemic humility that this is a difficult morality or ethics is a difficult field of study. There are lots of positions, even uh, you mentioned just within utilitarianism, there are act utilitarians or rule utilitarians, and there are differences within those. There are hedonistic utilitarians, pluralistic utilitarians. So there are a whole host of positions. So I do think humility is a good thing there. But one thing that I'd like to question you on is with your example of the fire. Okay, so I agree with you that, look, I mean, when I was 5 years old, I knew it was wrong to steal, and I had no clue about the ontological grounding or nature of moral truths or anything like that. So they're not necessary, but I wouldn't say that they're irrelevant. And I think that's what you were saying, because sure, would you, well, let me ask you, would you agree that understanding the ontological nature of morality and the grounding or foundation is important, and potentially it could have an impact on how we live our moral lives? So maybe I know certain properties about the fire, like it burns me or something like that, so don't touch it. But perhaps if I learn about the ontological nature of that I'm just living in the matrix and it's not really an ontological fire, it's just a computer generated program, and my mind can then manipulate the things, maybe I can touch the fire and I won't get burned. So potentially the ontological questions could be relevant for how we understand the properties. What do you make of that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, so I wasn't making the case that the ontology is irrelevant at all, only that it isn't necessary for just evaluating the consistent application of reasoning to the properties that you do agree on, if you see what I mean. So long as you and I, so long as it's a shared human experience that we agree on that fire is going to burn my finger when I put my finger in there, and we don't want pain, we're going to agree that that it's a bad idea to turn on the stove and put your finger in there, that kind of thing. So it's not that the any ontological account is irrelevant. It is just not necessary in the case of agreeing upon already agreed upon characteristics that we can use to predict the world as it was. And of course, it totally makes sense that an ontology, further understanding of what something is and how it arises, can help you understand the world at our macro level that we experience it. So I mean, we could talk. We could, for instance, hard drives. Hard drives back from the early '80s or whatever, before the original hard drives. We would, if we understand that those are based on the type of physics that drill down into the phenomena of quantum particles, etc., and you start to learn about also at the level of atoms and electrons, etc., you later learn more about the nature of hard drives and what you can do to improve them. So now our hard drives actually work on things like electron spin that we understand from the deeper physics, and which make them work much better and have more capacity and that kind of stuff. So an ontology can definitely be useful and can also guide how you think about the thing on the regular layman's level. I'm just saying, as I said, I was only making the case for consistency.
Gotcha.
It's not relevant.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yep. All right. Cool. Yeah. Okay. I agree with your point in that case there. One thing I
should just say that if fire came from God, there may be some caveats involved with God and fire that make us wary of how we use fire. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah. True enough. Yeah. And another thing that I thought it could also, moral ontology could be, or an ontological foundation could be important for people that don't agree. So if we don't have that common agreement that fire burns or something, who knows who would do that, but pretend there is someone. Potentially it could be useful in that, if you explain what the fire is ontologically, how it interacts with our bodies or something like that. That may convince them. Like, yeah. All right. And your second argument that I got was about, so this contrast between, so we have knowledge through moral intuitions, or properly basic beliefs, as I like to call them, versus arguments. And I think you're entirely right that
Can I just
sometimes.
step in there? I'm sorry. Can I just step in? I would. I'd be very cautious about calling intuitions knowledge. I think I know some philosophers would call them a type of knowledge, even ones that they're not. They're like analytical knowledge, or knowledge not necessarily based on experience and that kind of stuff. But I sort of think of it more as, say, strongly held mental attitudes or beliefs that may or may not have been built up from evidence, but which are sort of hard to shake. They're like prima facie versions of what seems to be right to us. So I don't know that I'd be careful about just instantly qualifying them as knowledge, as it seems like you would want to do.
Well, certainly, I would qualify. There are certain intuitional beliefs that are properly basic versus improperly basic, and that sort of thing. So that I could qualify. What I'm saying is, I was just sort of focusing on the ones that would count as a warranted true belief, as a, in the way, in a properly basic way, or something like that. But obviously, yeah, we do have intuitions that can be false, and that's why.
Yeah.
And that's why I agree with your point about, arguments from derivative knowledge can potentially overwhelm intuitional knowledge. I'll say it that way to contrast it with intuitions, or our intuitions. But I was just wondering, do you see it as sort of a one-way street, or can our intuitions in a wider sense ever amount to knowledge in a way that can overwhelm an argument, in terms of the degrees of knowledge that it, or warrant that it provides, in your opinion?
So this is this is the tough question that I was trying to sort of get at. It feels sort of hard to escape. It feels hard to escape that your theory about almost anything will want to preserve some intuitions, even if it means abandoning certain other ones. And at the same time, I have to admit that I don't like that, and that I feel some affinity with the philosophers who argue against any appeal to intuitions, and that knowledge should be essentially derivative, even if you have to make some certain assumptions. But even those assumptions or axioms can be justified with reference to other ones, etc. So I guess what I'm saying is I am really wary of signing on to the idea that our intuitions ultimately will prevail over strong sort of logic, piecing together something coherent from our experience. I hope that you understood that. I'm not sure I made that clear.
Yep. Yeah. Crystal clear. Yeah, perfect. I would just sort of qualify. Yeah, I think you're right. We need to be careful in the use of both the arguments, derivative knowledge and intuitional knowledge, and be careful in our assessing to what degree are we warranted based on these quote unquote evidences, and then you can compare it. Maybe the arguments outweigh the intuitional thing, or maybe vice versa. Like, obviously I would agree with you. There are cases in the Bible where arguments are outweighing my own intuitions.
Yes.
So not warranted intuition, but like, I definitely, yeah, there are. I mean, the biggest mistake Tara ever did was with the focusing on the Abraham test, because she once raised an issue that actually did cause me cognitive dissonance, the issue of the 10 plagues of Egypt, and do those constitute war crimes or something. That that one made me stop and think. And my own intuition was, yeah, there's something to this objection kind of thing. And at the end, I used arguments, derivative knowledge from divine revelation to over counter that. But it wasn't something that sat easy. It was difficult to kind of weigh the two forms of evidence and see, well, which one am I actually warranted in going with, and that sort of thing. So
Yeah, if I might just jump in there for a sec. So yeah, so the thing with the intuitions is that seems to me that I mean, the idea, for instance, is that we can find out that some of our intuitions, that if we have a good enough theory, then we can decide that certain intuitions are just wrong. We can sort of dispense them as wrong. Say, so it could be, we've got an intuition maybe that we haven't thought much about, but has sort of been built up just by unconscious experience in a way, that the world we live on is, say, flat, or that when I'm standing still on it, I'm standing still. When somebody comes along and tells you, actually, no, you're traveling at, 1,000 miles per hour as the Earth revolves, that you're actually traveling around at a great speed, even when you think you're standing still, that certainly seems to thwart that intuition. But the theory being strong enough, you just say, well, that intuition is wrong. That one can go. I'm not too nonplussed about that one going because the theory is just so fruitful otherwise that I can just admit an intuition is wrong. There's other times, and this tends to come up in coming up with moral theories, where it's an intuition that feels harder to let go. It feels more like you're biting the bullet, saying, damn, I wouldn't like to get rid of this one, but I guess I got to kind of put that one off to the side, given the strength of how the rest of my intuitions are upheld, if you see what I mean. So I think there's different scenarios for different intuitions.
Cool. All right. So yeah, David, I do have other questions for Val, but it's not based on his opening speech. So what would you?
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Val so that he can comment directly on your opening speech, and he can also ask you questions related to that, and then we'll get into some more general conversation. I've actually got a question for both of you, and because I don't take notes and I've got a really bad memory, I'm just going to put it out in the world right now. And then you can address it as you like. But can you talk about moral ontology in a way that is separate from human ontology? I mean, I hear a lot of discussion about moral ontology over the internet and so forth. But I don't hear Christians talk about the nature of humans so much. They're talking about the nature of morality and trying to work their way to God. But it seems to me that if you have a moral ontology that runs counter to the nature of humans, then there's something wrong with your moral ontology. And so are those two things really as separate and independent as they seem to be as people talk about them? Or must we have ontologies that are consistent with one another, both moral and human? That's my question. Both of you can address that as you will, but I don't want to cut into your opportunity to rebut Dale's opening argument, so I'm throwing it to Val.
Yeah, Dale. David. No. I can certainly hang on to that and put it on the shelf, because I think that's going to come up in any case, and it's worth laying a bit more groundwork before we get there, if that's all right. And so as far as the questions for Dale, I'm just looking at luckily, Dale, I appreciate that you actually wrote out your 4 propositions and they were on the email, so I get to look at them here. And well, my first thing would say before I start probing any of them is that you mentioned a lot of this sort of based on, well, first of all, I thought you were, when you, I thought you were headed towards deontology, and then when you were going to amend it with something else, I thought you were probably going to go towards something that resembled like rule utilitarianism, which a lot of people, it's almost like an attempt to merge deontology with utilitarianism. And try and disband the weaknesses of each. But you actually went with virtue ethics to try and combine, which is interesting because often those are. No, I gotta say, I'm not a virtue ethicist, and my knowledge of virtue ethics isn't very strong at all. But I know generally that you don't normally see the combination of deontology with virtue ethics. But anyways, I was going to ask. So your theory seems to be obviously a cognitive theory, and I think it's worth sort of stating maybe for the audience, like the difference between cognitive theories and non-cognitive. So I could quickly get that out of the way and ask you about it. So like in cognitivism, like with respect to moral discourse, generally means that moral statements, moral judgments, moral rules, and moral principles, they make reports or claims that are either true or false. And so a non-cognitivism would, with respect to moral discourse, would say the moral statements are neither true nor false. And yours seems to be an obvious cognitive system. And I want to ask whether and that makes sense from anybody who's a theist, right? Who's generally theists are trying to ground morality on a person, on God, and I haven't heard of a non-cognitivist theistic moral system. Have you?
No, not theist. Not from a theist for sure.
I just wondered, you would know if there was, and I was just curious about that.
No one's springing to mind. Like, I can't think of any theist non-cognitivists. So, just for the audience, so an example of a non-cognitivist theory in metaethics defining morals would be emotivism. So, moral statements or truths reduced down to mere statements of emotion. So, it was wrong for Hitler to kill the Jews is kind of like, I hate that Hitler killed the Jews or something. It's a statement of an emotion. So, yeah, I can't think of any theists who hold to a non-cognitivist view.
I also want to ask you about, are there also yours would be a moral realism. So like some moral statements are true versus moral anti-realism where no moral statements are true. So, I mean, most theistic moral theories are moral realist. Are there any that you know of? See, this is what I want about the nature of this conversation, by the way. I'm not trying to like debate and score points. I'm just actually curious about learning more. And so are there any moral anti-realist theistic theories that you know of?
Theories?
Sorry.
Moral.
Yeah, are there? Yeah, I was just curious if there's any moral anti-realist theories among theists. There wouldn't be, would there?
Again, same. None that are springing to mind.
Okay, I just wondered if there was some big gap in my knowledge that there was something going on that I never heard of. So just about your first 4 points here. So it seems to be most of them are generally acceptable to me. It makes sense. So like a judgment, truth is moral if accepted as supremely authoritative. So by supremely authoritative, well, I get. As soon as you say authoritative, I think of immediately leading to, a William Lane Craig thing that they must. It's like commandments given by a competent authority, which of course is going to be God. So I'm going to reject that. But you were taking the statements in themselves as supremely authoritative, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Rules themselves are supremely authoritative.
Yeah, they're an overriding, supremely overriding guide for conduct, attitudes, and motives.
Yeah, and then so it entails a prescriptive, categorical imperative, as per Kant and Mackey, etc. So now that's an interesting one that I would actually like to get into later, because I certainly get why you want the categorical imperative. But I think there's some interesting challenges to that. But I don't want to get into it yet.
Okay.
But did you actually? So I might have missed it. Did you actually tell the audience the difference between Kant's categorical imperative versus hypothetical? Did you make that clear?
I think I did. David, was I clear when I explained that, or you would be the voice of the audience?
I have no idea. I wasn't taking notes.
Okay, so
During my periods of silence, I might be in the bathroom, guys.
Okay.
You don't need me. I'm going back.
If I'm making sense.
I'm going back to snacking.
Dale, do you want to make it clear the difference between categorical and hypothetical imperatives per Kant?
Yeah. So in terms of categorical imperatives, so I prefer to call it to highlight the difference. It's a prescriptive imperative. Okay. So it's prescribing certain conduct or attitudes or motives in a given situation. Maybe that's an easier way for the audience who don't know about the technical terms or something, versus a mere hypothetical indicative. So I guess versus just a mere descriptive situation. So a hypothetical indicative would be like, if you want to be elected the politician, you ought to kiss the baby or something like that. The prescriptive imperative is more, there's this categorical moral rule, I guess, or moral imperative that you morally ought to do this or that, and it recommends certain actions based on a certain situation. There was also one thing about the first criterion that I wanted to say, because there could be some disagreement even among Christians on that one, where I say it's supremely authoritative. Do you mind if I?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So in the first place, when I say it's supremely authoritative, some Christians might disagree with that, and they'll say, well, religious duties can sometimes outweigh moral duties or considerations. So when I sort of I conflate religious duties as moral duties. So this is why I'm comfortable saying moral duties are supremely authoritative. I don't see them in conflict with religious duties, but there can be a definitional difference that some Christians might take issue with there. And also I did qualify about the highest degree of incumbency, and that was with respect to non-moral truths. But there is this moral hierarchy when two or more moral principles come into conflict or something, and in that case, they don't all have the highest degree of incumbency. Sometimes you have to pick the lesser of two evils or something like that.
So I have to jump in with a clarification question. How is that different from situational ethics? I know it's at a kind of a surface trivial level, you might see a difference there, but when you dig a little, is saying is there is a definite prescriptive morality in every situation, depending on what the situation is. And since no two situations are exactly alike, you would need almost a God level knowledge of things to know exactly what the moral prescription is. So it's not enough to say you cannot kill except in self-defense. Because then you get a situation where two people kill and one person may be ruled, well, that wasn't self-defense. Well, but sir, there was a man with a gun there, but his gun didn't have any bullets, and you could have overpowered him if you rushed him. But I didn't know that. So I mean, So what is the exact right thing for that situation? It depends on knowing all of the contextual elements almost beyond a human capacity to know. And so in that, every situation might have a different moral prescription based on the godlike knowledge that we don't have. So if any of that makes any sense, how is what you're saying different from me just saying situational ethics?
Yeah, so it'd be with the moral principles, which are the overriding guides that apply to multiple situations, and they can be applied in different ways depending on what it's not that you have to know the full context. It's just you have to know the morally relevant facts to make. And again, these no system of ethics is going to be perfect, right? One of the arguments I had for when I thought we are going to discuss utilitarianism is I argued it's impossible to know everything, because everything becomes a judgment.
Right, but you're determining the moral prescription based on the situation, correct? I mean, you're not walking in with a set of rules and saying, okay, I must always do this when X happens. You're always evaluating the situation to determine what you should do. And so sometimes the situation might call for you to kill someone, even though there is a kind of a general rule saying thou should not kill. That's what I call situational ethics, and I'm just trying to understand how you're differentiating what you're saying from that.
Well, yeah. So the rules apply in every single situation. The moral rules or principles will apply in every single situation. But yes, there is when you're filling out the content or something. So sometimes situations could make it different. So that cop, right? You raised the example, the cop that the guy used the taser and shot or something like that, and he shouldn't have shot the criminal. He should have realized, oh, he shot it twice, so therefore he should have known better or something, and should have ran to tackle him or something like that, right? So when you're filling out the specific morally relevant situation can inform how we apply these universal moral principles that prescribe conduct, but the principles are always there in every single situation. It's just a matter of how we apply it, that where the situational ethics or kind of informs how we apply those principles, right? So, yeah.
Okay, I will let you get back to it. I just wanted to get some clarification on that while it was on my mind. I'm still not sure that I'm clear on it, but I will let you get back to answering Val's rebuttal question.
Okay, so Dale, so yeah, I mean, I'm generally fine with this proceeding on from one and two. When you talk about it entails a prescriptive, categorical imperative. That's one that I'll come back to, I think, later on, because I think there's some interesting ideas that that morality can actually derive from hypothetical imperatives, which may seem counterintuitive, but I think there's some interesting stuff there. So, but I'm going to skip that for now. And your idea that it's universalizable, that I'm good with that, because that seems to me to be right. And let's see, it involves or pertains to one or more moral agents or persons. I don't see any problem with that off the bat. So there's that. I could talk for a second about objectivity, like because we're making our way towards, we're being a bit descriptive right now. We want to make our way towards what would count as an objective morality, and also what is the ontological basis of say, an objective morality. So I could talk for a second about that, if that's
Sure.
all right.
You're in charge here, Val. You got me on the grill, so.
Okay. So let me just see here. Okay. So when we're talking about objective, it's I guess in philosophy, it tends to be often reduced to something like something is objective, or fact is objective if it's a mind-independent fact. If it would exist or be true, whether there's a mind thinking about it or not. That's the most wide-ranging one. But I mean, when you start talking about moral theories and objectivity and other things, that's too spare. So, if a mind exists, well, that's got to be a fact, right? And the fact will depend on the existence of that mind. So you need to be able to say a mind exists. And if you got two minds that exist, and one mind holds the opinion that only one mind exists, you got to be able to say, no, a second mind exists, another mind exists. That's a fact, even though that fact is derived from the fact of that a mind exists. So it's not totally independent of the existence of a mind. So you got to be able to talk about facts as it pertains to minds too. So if mind number one thought I'm the only mind that exists, and there's another one that exists, well, that first mind is just simply wrong. He's made it an objectively wrong statement or belief, and so an objective fact you can maybe boil it down to more like it's a fact that's one that's true or independent of a person's belief or opinion about that fact. You know, it's got a truth value, as it were. And I'm just going to shove in here for a sec that when talking about objective morality, you'll often see certain theists and apologists using objective in in another way, where they rephrase it, or where they phrase it as objective is something like it's a true independent of any human mind. And of course, that's a bit self-serving because it allows them to say, but it's based on God's mind, you know, and to be not special pleading, that kind of stuff like that. But if you took the more standard view of objectivity, you can't just lead to God's opinion being making things objective. But just you don't have to immediately talk about that now. So now, as far as objective
I'll just
go on.
I'll just quickly say this. So I think that is kind of a. So you're right that ultimately when we get to the grounding, it does all go back to God, who has a mind. But the moral principles aren't grounded in God's mind. They're grounded in His morally perfect nature, and that's a distinction that will matter, right? Moral
sure, we can get into that. I know you have rebuttals to that, but I mean, it's just like if you if you make that distinction, you first have to get over the hurdles. Like, well, if aliens showed up and they thought that the Twin Towers in the U.S. were still standing after 9/11, it doesn't matter that they're not human; they're wrong too. So other minds that aren't human can be wrong too. So you got to get through those hurdles to end up getting your exemption for God. That's what I mean. But as far as looking to see if a moral theory is objective, there is you sort of have to be careful here, because there is what like Moore, I think it was Moore would point out as a trivial way with his open question of defining a moral theory as being objective, where you can just define something as the good, and therefore what ought to be done, and then there are obtained from that objective facts about what ought to be done. And so, for instance, to show how trivial it can be, right? I can just define that pleasing David Johnson is good, and therefore there's going to be objective facts about what pleases David Johnson that are good. And there we go. We've got objective rules for what ought to be done. So you can sort of leap from one to the other, but it seems a bit trivial because you can sort of define almost anything as a starting point and then draw facts as to what will satisfy the oughts of that system. So that's now there are a number of moral theories that nonetheless make something like that move. Like, for instance, Sam Harris's theory is often accused of making that move, of just defining the good as essentially what would be the well-being of conscious entities, and increasing the well-being of conscious entities, or something like it, is good. Decreasing or anything that thwarts it will be bad. And then, as he pointed out, and once you learn about the what makes a conscious entity, once you learn more things about the well-being of a conscious entity, say if you take a human being, there's going to be facts about what will thwart our well-being and what will support our well-being. And so people can say, well, that's one of those easy cases of just sort of defining your axiom and then everything sort of follows from it. And I think there's something to that charge, but I don't think it's that easy a rebuttal of what Harris is doing. But the big prize isn't making that move. Like Harris says, look, I can make that move because even in science and everywhere else, we're actually making axiological assumptions. And so here's mine. But the big prize in the objective moral theory is that not that there are objectively true facts that derive from an axiom that you may define arbitrarily, but that the basis itself, the moral theory itself and its axiom is itself an objective fact. So that it's sort of an irrefutable objective fact itself. So it is really the only theory which is the objectively true one. So that's the big prize that people go for, and some have better thrust at it than others, I think.
Yeah, that sounds right to me, right? Yeah, the basic foundation upon which the rest of the moral actions or beliefs or whatever are founded on, yeah, that's got to be objectively true. And it's not just, okay, let's start with this axiom, whether unwarranted or not, and go from there. And that was kind of the example I gave. So philosophers will, I sort of put this, and I think you kind of defended me, Val, when I was debating with Darren on the comment boards months ago about, like, okay, well, given humanism, we should do this or that, or we ought to do this or that. And I was saying, okay, but why adopt humanism versus human destructionism? What can you say if Donald Trump is got his finger on the nukes and he says, I'm going for human destructionism? There's nothing Darren can say to say, no, you ought to prefer the goal of humanism or something like that. And philosophers phrase this in this is a problem in meta-ethical relativism, where it's kind of, how do you, okay, why should someone adopt the quote unquote moral point of view in the first place? Some people will just say, no, I don't want to follow that or something. And if you want to have an objective fact to say, no, well, you ought to do this. This is what is actually good. And yeah, if you don't have that, if you've just got this axiom, there's not much you can say. It leads to those problems of moral relativism and arbitrariness.
Yeah, so I think that gets to, I think that suggests the role of reason in establishing something as objective. But personally, I don't want to jump to that yet. I wouldn't mind, unless you have something else you want to say beforehand, I wouldn't mind discussing Hume's is-ought dilemma, because I think that's another thing that relates to the ground for the problem of ontology for a system. Would you like me to speak about it, or is there anything else you want to say or add in?
Yeah, no, I'm happy for you to go ahead with the is-ought problem there.
Okay.
Yeah. So before you do that, I want to do one thing, because it looks like we're getting into a conversation phase, and I don't want to interrupt that when it's going well. I won't, before you get into the is-ought, which is a big piece of this, I think, I would like to hear both of you kind of describe your definition of the good, because one of my theories is that Christians and non-Christians are not talking about the same thing. At a trivial level, they may be kind of talking about the same thing. It sounds like they're talking about the same thing, but as the conversation gets deeper, you realize that they are actually not talking about the same thing. And so we'll see how this conversation goes. But before it goes too far, I'd like to see if up front we can get some definitional understanding of the good, because every time I have this conversation, somewhere in the conversation, the Christian accuses me of, well, I don't understand the good, or I'm just assuming that the good is this, and my evaluation of the good may be wrong. Well, at that point, I realize, well, we're not talking about the same thing at all. So with that, I will ask both of you to just kind of briefly define what you mean by the good, and we may revisit this later in the conversation.
Go
Val.
Go ahead. Okay. Yeah. So, like I said, I haven't settled on any particular theory, but I do find some more compelling than the others, which seem to at least get off to a better start. And one I was going to bring up later on, and I would like to discuss it more later on, because we're moving towards this sort of objectivity and ontology, would actually be a utilitarian theory, and it's desirism, and it sees desires as the ontological basis of value. So what is good is that which is such as to fulfill the desires in question, and morality consists on evaluating desires themselves on their ability to fulfill or thwart other desires. But you're going to need an explanation of that, and that'll come later.
All right. So my research wasn't in vain on utilitarian.
No.
Okay. All right. So David, yeah, my answer to your question is, I understand what you're doing, but I sort of see it as almost like a trick, because you're trying to take away common ground. I'm not saying this is what your motive is, but it comes across that way sometimes, because it's kind of like what Val was saying with his example of the fire. We all have, look, I defined what moral truths are. I gave those 4 criteria, and you heard it from Val, apart from 1 or 2 minor issues, or that we more or less have common ground on what we're speaking about when it comes to moral truths. Where the differences perhaps come in is with the ontological grounding, but that's not necessary when we're speaking about just morals proper. A 5-year-old, I can have the same understanding as a 5-year-old, whether he understands, oh, well, does God provide the ontological grounding for moral principles or duties? They don't need that. So I think that, yeah, you're focusing on a particular aspect to drive a wedge kind of thing between where most people do have common ground. When we're talking about morals, we have this general sense of what we're talking about.
Sure. So I can appreciate that concern. I can assure you that is not the case. Yeah. I always go into the discussion of morality assuming that we're talking about the same thing, and I'm always proven wrong as the conversation goes on far enough. And so a lot of the conversation ends up being talking past one another because you're not, in fact, talking about the same thing. And so this is what I want to establish up front, either that we are, in fact, talking about the same thing or that we are not talking about the same thing. Because just as an example, and we've got several podcasts to go in this series, and so this question is going to be revisited again and again. But just as an example, if I say, well, human flourishing is good, and it's good that people never experience hunger. And it is quite frequently the case that the Christian will respond, well, wait a minute. It's not necessarily a good thing that humans never experience hunger. And then I have to wonder, well, what are you talking about when you're talking about good? Because we're not talking about the same category of thing anymore. If there's something that you see good about experiencing hunger, and so when we get into it definitionally, then, we get into, God's will and, God's ultimate plan and that sort of thing. And that becomes the definition of what is good. So I'm not trying to create a trap. I'm trying to avoid talking past one another as this moves forward.
Hey, David, if I can try and answer that.
Yes.
So number one, I would say that that can kind of be, you can say that we are trying to find out when talking about the good or morality what we ought to do or ought not do. And so if you have a disagreement of the type you just talked about, you may be disagreeing there. You're not disagreeing on the project of the morality that you both share. You're disagreeing on a specific recommendation. And so since you both share the project of justifying what we ought to do or not, you can, on that level, discuss whether one act is more justified than the other. So you have that as your shared guide. And secondly, Dale's 4 propositions, I can sort of accept them enough so that we can sort of go on with this conversation. So I feel like we are generally talking about the same thing, at least enough to move along. So that's how I would answer that question.
Okay, then I will see the conversation move along, but I'll be watching it closely.
But just to back you up there, David, just because I threw that out there or whatever, but yeah, there is normative ethical theories, right? That kind of, well, how do we determine the good or the good versus bad thing to do, right? So utilitarianism, as Val would say, based on a principle of utility or something like that, or deontology. It's okay. Well, something's good if it follows a moral rule.
Right, principle. But don't go too fast back by that, because Val's utilitarian explanation there, just as an example that he gave, I don't know if he was saying this is how he believes, but the utility might be to fulfill a desire. And that's at the heart of then deciding what is the utility to fulfill that. But the Christian would, I think, almost universally say fulfilling human desire is not the goal at all. And that has no part of it. And so at that point, you do have a fundamental disagreement. And no matter how nicely you talk past that, you're not talking about the same thing.
That's why I tried to sort of lay the groundwork as to what generally moral theories are trying to achieve. And if what I said was agreeable, then we do have sort of grounds to agree upon whether one theory is fulfilling those duties or not. Do you see what I mean, Dale, or do you?
Yeah. All right. All right. Well, yeah. I guess at this point, do you mind if I probe you a little bit, just to so you would agree, Val, from what I'm getting?
And I'm gonna go ahead and step out of the conversation here and let you go back and forth. I'll jump in from time to time, but with limited commercial breaks.
Cool.
Okay. Perfect. So yeah, you would agree, Val, on your end. You would disagree with skeptics like David, who are moral subjectivists. You are, first, you do think morality is objective, is the sense that I'm getting.
Well, I find moral realist theories more compelling. Yeah.
Gotcha. And
I just find I'll just put it that way for now. Yeah.
Okay. And in terms of your own position on normative ethical theories, my understanding is you don't have a firm opinion one way or the other. You're kind of open to the merits of some. Are there any normative, like ethical egoism, for example? Is that, can you rule that out, or are you open to that still?
Yeah. No, I don't think ethical egoism really works either, and for reasons that I guess get into the role of reason. It seems to me various moral theories have had insights that strike me as hard to disagree with, and at some point I might get off board with them, but I retain some of those insights. And so like there's insights as far as the role of reason in establishing morality, like from Kant and elaborations of Kant that seem to make sense for me. So I sort of incorporate that into even a utilitarian theory as well, sort of the way you're trying to combine theories as well.
Gotcha. Okay. And with the utilitarianism then, so I think I got a glimpse of you hinting at in terms of so there are different aspects to utilitarian theory that we can focus on. The first one that both you and David have mentioned is, okay, well, what's the theory of value? What is this unit of utility that we're trying to get? What is the valuable thing? And it sounds like you would take sort of the more modern subjective preference utilitarian view rather than just a hedonistic utilitarian view or a pluralistic utilitarian view. Is that?
And that's closer to it. It's not specifically preference utilitarianism or motive utilitarianism. It's more very specifically, the one I find more interesting is, it used to be called desire utilitarianism. Now it's called desirism. It's by Alonzo Fife, very interesting guy. But now, certainly go ahead and ask your questions. I was sort of heading towards this, so trying to lay some more groundwork about is the role of reason, and then once we have that in view, talking about now what can we ground morality in as far as the ontology, and is it objective or not? Okay, so so I want to get from Hume and the ontological questions that arise from his observation, and then the role of reason, which obviously plays a big role in your theory of morality. So the whole Hume's is observation, since it came from just essentially one short paragraph that he wrote, I think it's worth just reading it to the audience to see, and this really made a big splash in philosophy. So this is just reading Hume in his Old English. He's from the Scottish philosopher from the 1700s. He said, in every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a god or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, or facts, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it's necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from the others, which are entirely different from it. But as authors do not commonly use this precaution, I shall presume to recommend it to the readers, and am persuaded that this small attention would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality, and let us see that distinction of vice and virtue is not founded merely on the relations of objects, nor is perceived by reason. So, I mean, I think that was around the time when Hume he thought that morality was essentially derived from sentiment or the passions. He was sort of acting like a subjectivist, almost even like a non-cognitivist, where he's saying that this is good means I like it, but he wasn't really a non-cognitivist. But anyway, the point is he's pointing out the distinction between facts and values, between is statements of fact and ought statements about values or what we ought to do. And he's pointing out that, I mean, we all in our everyday understand that a fact statement doesn't entail an ought. So, if I just made the statement, my house is on fire, nobody recognizes that as establishing or entailing that my house ought to be on fire. Or if I tell you a fact that there's children starving in some part of the world, that's a statement of fact and is statement. It is the case that some children are starving. Nobody leaps from that to it entailing children ought to be starving in that part of the world. And so you can just keep piling up factual statements. The sky is blue, the grass is green, bus number 85 leaves in 10 minutes. And you will never get from those statements of fact is statements to automatically entailing an ought statement. And what he's pointing out is that, but when people start talking about their morality, people seem to suddenly slip into this equivocation naturally and not even noticing it, and that we're so used to it that most of us don't even notice it. And he's bringing it to our attention that anytime somebody has made a statement that's an is statement, it seems to be a fact statement, that you're supposed to also accept as establishing an ought statement, you should say, hold on, wait, one seems different from the other, and you need to at least give me an explanation of how you're deriving one from the other or moving from the is statement to the ought. And so this philosopher sort of caught on to this and dug into it, and there's been all sorts of views. There are some views where philosophers have decided that you just can't derive an ought from an is. It's just impossible, and it's so impossible that it's become what's known to them as Hume's law. It's a law that you can't derive an ought from an is. Whereas you have other philosophers, moral philosophers, saying no, you can derive an ought from an is, and this is how you do it. And they're especially those who think that you simply can't get an ought from the world that is. You start thinking about, well, if there is ought, then it's not part of the world that is. If ought exists, then it's got to be in some realm separate from the world of facts that is, all the facts we can talk about in this world. And so then you do get some philosophers who bite that bullet and say, yeah, I think oughts do exist, real oughts, but they're, for instance, in a Platonic realm, Platonic oughts. And so, you get problems with that, like you have any problems with any theory, but that's what I'm saying, where an ontological problem comes up, is can you find ought in the world of is? And if not, do oughts exist? And if they do, what is the nature of the existence of those oughts? So that's what you get out of Hume's is and ought.
Yeah, it's not much to add. Like I agree with a lot of what you said there, but just a helpful way for the audience that I found when I taught the class on ethics back last summer. One way that I phrased it to think of the is-ought gap problem or whatever, or the fact that you cannot derive an ought from an is to think of it this way. So pretend you have premise one in a deductive argument. So Jenny is being put in pain by John poking her with a pen. This is a factual descriptive proposition or premise, right? It's the is. Jenny is in pain because John is poking her with the pen. So that's the factual statement. And then you have a conclusion saying, therefore, John ought to stop poking Jenny with a pen. And there's this gap. It's a non sequitur argument. So you need to plug in some additional premises to plug that gap and get to that ought. And the way I would do that from my position on morality is I would plug in a moral principle as a premise number two. And then I would plug in a premise three saying, one ought to not violate a moral principle or something. So that could be a helpful way of understanding. You've got this premise one, this factual is statement or descriptive statement. You've got a conclusion, a prescriptive conclusion. John ought to stop poking this girl with this pen. And how do you plug that gap? What premises do you plug in to fill it? And obviously, I have my answer as a moral deontologist and virtue ethicist or something like that. But yeah, like that, just for understanding the problem, there is that gap. What premises do you, as an atheist or a Christian or whatever, what do you plug in there to get that conclusion as a logically deductive argument?
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. I'm sorry, Dale.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think, to me, it drives me crazy when, for instance, people like Sam Harris, who think they've essentially solved the is-ought problem, or not even solved it, dismissed it as not even a problem.
Yeah.
It drives me crazy because, okay, if you solved it, that's fine. I'm willing to listen. But what I can't stand is the idea of the baby being thrown out with the bathwater, because it is an extremely powerful tool once you just recognize it for, as Hume said, to recognize vulgar systems of morality. So it's just it starts to become so easy to notice when somebody is making an is statement that you're supposed to presume, or they're presuming, entails an ought, just like the one you gave. But it also, I mean, even like atheists can use it. Atheists recognize this all the time when a theist says God commanded to do X. Well, that's an is statement. It is the fact that God commanded X. How do you derive ought from that? You've got to give me your explanation. Yeah. And then there's questions about how you get there, and it's fairly it's fairly commonly acknowledged by lots of philosophers that you can kind of draw a bridge by sticking in a goal, for instance, in between. So it's not that you are deriving ought from an is statement. You are providing a bridge between you're providing a bridge from the ought to the is statement via a goal. So if I have the goal of driving to New York, then I ought to have my fill up my gas tank, that kind of stuff like that. So you put in a goal and you get from sort of is to ought. But there's also attempts to directly derive ought from is, which I find interesting too. But again, that we'll get to, as we go on.
Okay, so that's an interesting idea. Dale, tell me, the is-ought conundrum that's being discussed right now, doesn't the Christian and the atheist have the same is-ought problem, or do you feel that one has the advantage?
So yeah, as Val said, there can be the same problem in terms of the premise, right? How do you derive that conclusion? And the Christian theists will have different answers to that. So I would say that I think the Christian is better suited to plug the gap. There are additional premises to make that conclusion deduct.
Right. But aren't the additional premises also just is statements? I mean, at the end of the day, you can try deontology. Well, there's a law that says you shouldn't do that, but you're still trying to derive, therefore you should obey the law. And you haven't made that connection. Or you can say, well, it's virtuous to cause pleasure rather than pain, but you still haven't created an ought there. And so I was listening very closely to your efforts to kind of your suggestions as to how to plug the gap. It doesn't seem to me that they actually plug the gap at all.
Well, they do actually. So taking the deontologist answer and leaving virtue ethics out of it and everything like that, just that simple deontological thing. So I gave two premises. I didn't even need to do that, but I'm just spelling it out. But so premise two would be, okay, what's the moral principle? Moral principle, the principle of non-malfeasance, do no harm to people, is being violated. That's an is statement, right?
Yep. So I don't care.
So then premise three is one ought not to violate moral principles.
Right. And that's the leap. That's the leap that you're making. Anytime you put in an ought, it's always a leap. I don't care that there's a law of doing no harm. I want to do harm. You can't get me from the fact that there's a law to do no harm to I ought not to do harm. You just think that you're plugging the gap, but you're not actually plugging the gap. You're just creating another gap.
No, it's plugging the gap. But what you're objecting to is you're saying you don't buy my premise. You think it's an unsound premise there.
No, I'm saying that It's just a gap. You're just adding another is. So yes, I understand. I will even accept there is a rule to do no harm. You can name any rule you want, and I'll just accept it for the sake of this conversation and say, so how do we get to the ought from that rule? You have not gotten me there. You've just piled more ises, as if logs on the fire. You're just building a bigger fire.
No, man. Premise 3 is not an is statement. It's a
No,
prescriptive.
that's right. But you just pull that. You could have gotten. You didn't have to have the other premises. You're just jumping to an ought. Now you may be explaining more about why you think that ought should happen, but you were not logically making a prescription that I have to follow. It's kind of like saying, well, God knows the ultimate good for humans, and that's why you should obey God. But I can still say I don't want the ultimate good for humans. I want the second best good for humans. Why ought I want the ultimate good for humans? You have not bridged the gap by just making another is statement.
But that it's not an is statement. It's an ought. It's a prescriptive. Premise number 3 is a prescriptive statement that I provide.
And so you haven't gotten me from premise 2 to premise 3. This is what I'm saying. You're right that premise 2 is an is statement and premise 3 is an ought statement, but there is no bridge.
It's a premise though. Like I would need to provide warrant for this, right? If you come and deny that premise and say, well, no, I think I ought to violate moral principles or something like that. So this third premise is wrong. And in the first place, when you plug under deontology, when I put in a moral principle and say that it's being violated, I don't need to spell out premise number 3. It's automatically assumed because deontology says it's good in and of itself not to violate moral principles. But what you're debating me on is the warrant for the premises, and I'm just
I'm not debating you on the warrant of the premises. I'm granting all of the premises to be true and saying you still hadn't made a bridge between is and ought. Okay, so Val, I just had a little bit of a challenge with Dale. You guys were talking about is and oughts, and Dale proposed a type of formula that might plug the gap. And I was simply saying that I find that unsatisfactory.
Well, as you stated it, I'd agree with you that you still have to be given a reason to accept the deontological rule he's putting forth.
Right, but I have to accept the reason.
Oh, I'm sorry?
I would have to accept the reason. This is the thing. The only ought that is valid for me is my acceptance of that ought. That's it. So you can give me a reason. You can give me a good reason not to cause unnecessary pain, but that reason does not translate to a necessary ought for me.
Dale, do you want to rebut? Were you getting David's point about trying to give him reasons to essentially accept your moral claims or your deontological rule? Did you want to do that? And whenever I can jump in because I have stuff that I think will probably maybe bolster what you're going to say. I think I understand it, but every time I state my understanding, David says no, I'm wrong. So I don't think I understand what his objection is. So my thinking with this is ought thing, right? We have premise 1, it's a descriptive state of affairs, and then we have a gap. We have the conclusion. Therefore, John ought to stop poking Jenny with the pen. And I plugged that gap with 2 premises. So the second premise is just another descriptive statement. It's stating that poking Jenny with a pin, causing her pain, violates a moral principle, the principle of non-malfeasance. Yep, you're right, there's no ought. That's a descriptive one. But then premise number 3 provides the prescriptive premise that says one ought not to violate a moral principle, and that this is stated as an objective fact. So David, he can't say he doesn't
buy that or not believe it. Or if he does, then it's in the form of a challenge, like, well, prove premise number 3 is true, is warranted, or something.
Right.
He's challenging my premise, essentially. But when I ask him, he says, no, that's not what I'm doing. So I don't get what he's trying to say.
Right. And so I am not challenging your premise that it is a moral rule, and that one, I'm not challenging that it's a moral rule. What I'm challenging is that one, therefore, ought not violate a moral rule. That's what I'm challenging.
Yeah. So you're challenging premise 3, and that's where I would need to go in and prove that this premise is true in some way.
Yes, you would have to prove that there is an ought here.
Yes.
Which leaves you exactly where you were with in the first place.
Well, no. So it's the problem that we started with was, how do we get to this specific conclusion that John ought to stop poking Jenny with a pin? And I've provided a way to get there, on condition that I can prove my gap-filling premises are in fact true. So it's on that condition. If that's all you're saying, then of course that's the same with every deductive argument, whether it's descriptive, whatever it is. You have to prove your premises are true for the conclusion to actually follow.
Right. So I don't want to belabor the issue, and I want you guys to get back to your conversation, unless you just want to make this a part of it. I know that there will be comments around this, but I just want the audience to understand my objection here. I am granting all of Dale's premises other than premise 3, which is you ought to do it. And all that is just a statement of the conclusion. You ought not violate moral rules is where we get the first ought statement here. So you have to go from this is a moral violation of an objective rule to I ought not violate it. And that's the work that you have ahead of you.
So I can jump in with something that I think might help both of us, Dale.
Yeah, sure.
Unless you have something to say that. I want to jump in.
Yeah, no need to address me further on this. I'm going to go on mute, and I'll go back to audience status.
Cool. Yeah, I'll let you have the last word on this one. I think we're good.
Oh, okay. So should I mention the role of reason?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah. So I think because I think this will play out in both of our theories, as it were. So it is a bit hard for me to precisely understand exactly David's objection, but it seems to be running along the lines of look, you can give me your moral claims, your theories, but I can always do what I want to anyway. And really, the only thing that gives me a reason to do something are the reasons I have and what I want to reject or not. And that is, it's funny because that kind of objection, I don't know if that captured exactly David's, but it's a very sort of common type of objection to moral theories. But it's a sort of a trivial form of objection that can object to any theory, no matter how sound, because even if you established through reason and say evidence a sound moral theory that there are objective right and wrongs, like say you establish it on God, you establish the existence of a God, and you establish through sound reasoning and evidence that morality derives from that God, and that God's commands entail an ought. And so if you should worship, God commands to worship me, you should worship me. Somebody can always say, well, yeah, so what? God said that, I'm not going to worship him anyway. And I don't have to, I don't want to. And that is sort of seen as a sort of a refutation of the reasoning. But it's not at all a refutation because of reasoning. What we're asking for when we're reasoning are what reasons exist to do something or not. So I mean, when the theist, for instance, even says something like, if there's no God, then why shouldn't I just steal your stuff or go rape your wife or all that kind of stuff like that? you can see immediately that what's being asked for is a reason for an action. You're asking for reasons, and we're in the realm of reasoning, and then so once you're doing that, you just have to keep in mind that we're in the realm of reason. You're asking for reasons, and if you're doing that, then you're going to be evaluating that the way you evaluate anything on reason. So let's just talk about reason for a second. What is reason? So Hume had a pretty pithy formulation, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing from memory, but it's like reason is that which we use to discover what is true and what is false. Or another pithy version is like reason's the faculty or process of drawing logical inferences. But it's reason actually, really, if you look at it, it's more expansive than that. It needs to encompass more. And actually the opening Wikipedia page is actually, I think, good on this because it expands on it. So take the first part. It says, reason is the capacity of consciously making sense of things, applying logic, and adapting or justifying practices, intuitions, and beliefs based on new or existing information, the use of the intellect. So something important to note is that reasoning, especially insofar as it incorporates logic, has the aim of reducing contradictions in our thinking. Reasoning is fundamentally about consistency and coherency, where we're trying to produce conclusions that fit without contradiction into an ever-widening coherent framework. This is why reasons can't admit of contradictions, and reason is inherently universalizing. It consists of using or discovering principles that are valid or sound for any rational being. So if I say, my desire to survive gives me a reason to leave this burning building, then this is inherently based on some principle of reason, such that anyone in the relevant situation who has a desire to survive a burning building will have the same reason to leave the building. And it's when people don't acknowledge the universalizing properties of reason, of its principle-based properties, that we object and point out to someone they're wrong on pains of inconsistency. We would not accept the claim, it's okay for me to speed over the speed limit because I want to, but not for you to speed because you want to, right? The first thing we say is, this is inconsistent. You have not given a reason for your speeding over the limit because it is not fitting consistently, and you're not using a principle consistently. You're special pleading, the fallacy of arguing on a rule that seems made up just for the individual. So the person can, of course, try and justify his own exception and say, but the speed limit doesn't pertain to me because I have red hair. But the problem is that will turn out to be, when you look at how it fits into the wider coherency of what we accept via reason, it'll turn out to be an irrelevant difference in terms of making that exception. Exceptions can be made, but they have to be made by appeal to relevantly different states of affairs, and making exceptions, the exceptions can be made, but they have to be made by appeal to relevantly different states of affairs, and making such exceptions itself depends on being consistent with the nature of the exceptions that we make elsewhere. So for instance, we will find justifications for why police cars can exceed the speed limit, and it'll be coherent with the exceptions we make for ambulances and fire engines, etc. So this is the nature of reason. It works on principles, it's universalizable, and it seeks consistency and coherency. So simply saying, but I want to, you've given me a rule that says I shouldn't steal your stuff, but I want to steal your, but so what? I want to steal your stuff. The question is whether you have reasons to reject the arguments establishing the principle, and whether you have better reasons for instance, stealing my stuff. And the problem is, those better reasons are going to be universalizable, and if they end up in contradictions, and if you don't provide a coherent framework for how your reason to steal my stuff fits in with the rest of the justifications you can offer for how you go about life, you're not going to be reasoning. You're not going to be giving a reason to either steal my stuff, or you're not going to be giving a reason to reject my argument. I mean, even the famous the whipping girl of philosophy, like Ayn Rand, right, who came up with her sort of virtuistic selfishness and her objectivism. Like there's no philosophy that I'm aware of that actually has justified pure individual selfishness. So even Ayn Rand would say that the realizing your own goals is something that everybody should do, and ultimately is the best way for us all to flourish. So it's universalizable. You can't get a purely selfish ethics because you just end up hitting too much inconsistency. So that's a problem. You can't just say, well, I reject it. Once you're asking for reasons for why you should or shouldn't do something, then we've got to be consistent.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I guess just one question on the use of rationality from the perspective of you sort of mentioned here along the lines of a utilitarian. So are you using prescriptive rationality or descriptive rationality in these judgments?
Am I using those for what?
So like with using prescriptive rationality, basically it entails two things, right? So you have to have the ability to have warranted beliefs about what is intrinsically valuable in the first place, and there are differences on that front. And two, having those beliefs appropriately inform one's desires. And some people will say on certain, like with utilitarianism, if it's subjective, a form of subjective utilitarianism, you can't get that. You have to revert to some sort of like pluralistic utilitarianism, which the problem with that form, the reason why most utilitarians today don't take that form is because, well, how do you judge the different value-laden items? David and Marvin were having a good argument about pleasure and hedonistic pleasure and pleasure versus pain ratio compared to truth with their joyous experience machine or something. And David was saying, well, I'll value the pleasure versus pain ratio, and Marvin was saying, no, truth is where we would get. So if you're going down the prescriptive objective route, the main issue with pluralistic thing is, well, how do you come up with a consistent way of judging each case, which values should take precedence and that sort of thing, especially if you don't just rely on like a deontological rule to help adjudicate that. So yeah, like that would be my question is, what are your thoughts on how you would make sense to prescribe which objective values are rational to go for?
Well, yeah, funny. I actually listened to part of that podcast, and I came to that part with the experience machine, and I always liked that thought experiment because I think it gets at some interesting thing, and I loved David's answer to it, which is that he would take it. And there are some moral theories that have trouble with David's answer, saying "count me in," and especially that have trouble with incommensurable values and that kind of stuff like that. So, whereas Marvin would not jump in the experience machine. So how do you solve that? I think that the particular utilitarian theory I'm going to bring in has something to say to that, and I could start with going into the whole thing, but am I allowed to ask you, since we had been looking at your statements as to, because we were trying to get along from your statements as to how you end up grounding something objective, and I had a question going on about whether you're grounding the objectivity in reason in your deontological rule, or whether you're somehow kicking that back and grounding it in God, and how do you make that move? Am I allowed to ask that now?
Yeah, sure.
And I promise you all the questions that you can push me on, I will absolutely get to them. You'll be able to knock them all down.
Okay. All right. Yeah. No, it's more just probing on my end. I'm not trying to, knock you down. I just want to know get your view, kind of thing.
I promise I'll get explicit on it.
All right, cool. So yes, I do. Obviously, I ground morality in God's nature, morally perfect nature. So everything goes back to that. Now, obviously, God is perfectly logical and rational by nature as well. So his moral nature is going to be consistent with rationality, and insofar as human beings' rationality is consistent with God's rationality, then we're all going to be in sync on that front. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so if you say you've got a deontological rule, the ought comes from the reasons from that rule or from God's nature. I'm still not clear on that. I mean, God may have a nature of being rational, but that still doesn't tell me why I ought to follow any deontological rule.
Yeah, so the reason we would follow the deontological rules, so number one, they are good to follow in and of themselves. And this is where the virtue ethics part comes in, because
okay, but that's exactly seems where you seem to be parting ways with God. It doesn't sound. I know you're going to get there, but that's where it says to me God isn't necessary for the goodness of those rules. God, it may be that the rules that God is rational and that God would affirm that rule, but insofar as that rule can be affirmed by a rational being, that's what you need, not a God. And insofar as we can understand the rational rule, it seems to me we can affirm that rational rule, and that seems to actually give the ought there without God. But keep going.
yeah, well, for sure, you don't necessarily need belief in God, right? The natural moral law is written on our hearts, but ontologically speaking,
that's what I'm saying. Ontologically speaking, it sounds like you don't need God from what I just said.
well, then I'm not sure I understand that, because the moral rules complement the production of certain virtuous character traits that are designed within us for our benefit. And that's in God's nature. Nature defines the good for all persons and that sort of thing, and He designs us consistent with His nature. So by following these moral rules, we develop characters that are fit for our purpose of life, or to have a deep well-being. I'm sort of a classical essentialist. I don't like more modern virtue ethicists that deny take an anti-essentialist view. So this is how they complement each other. These rules are good in and of themselves to follow, and they also produce desired character traits for me to fulfill my God-designed purpose in my life, and get that state of deep well-being, or bliss, as it's called.
Okay, so if you could give me a deontological one of your rules that is good in and of itself, I want to see how that derives from God.
How it derives? So
how it depends on God. I'm still not clear yet, because you keep saying good in and of itself, which to me says not dependent on a God.
Well, so put it this way. So there's a moral principle of justice, or moral principle of truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make any sense to say that, pretending that I've proven there are these principles. We don't seem to disagree on that, but I know David would. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say that these principles do exist in an objective, and I would want to push that to say necessary. They are logically necessary moral principles. Well, what on earth can ground them? It doesn't make sense to say the principle of justice just exists, or the principle of truth exists in some abstract way, any more than to say the number one exists. These are principles that have to be grounded in a person. A person is just, or an act is just, or something, right? So this is the first of three arguments that theists will give to say argue against something like atheistic moral Platonism, and they'll say the principles have to be grounded in persons. Persons are just. A principle, an abstract principle, can't be just in and of itself.
Yes.
And it makes no sense to say they exist, in my opinion. Okay, so as I said, I don't think it makes sense to picture abstract objects just existing. Like the principle of justice, they're necessarily attached. They only exist as being a part of the nature of a person or something.
I agree.
Okay. Oh, beautiful. All right. There's also the problem for atheists and skeptics. For the sake of a moment, let's pretend these abstract principles do somehow just exist in a Platonic realm. Well, there's also the principle of injustice or the principle of lying, and these exist in this abstract realm too. So there's the problem of why ought I to align myself to certain moral principles and not others? What is it that forces me to align in this way? Like with the God answer, I can provide the virtue ethics or the teleos answer, right? Because certain moral principles are good for us based on how God designed us to be and to live a good life. And then the final thing to defeat atheistic moral Platonism is the design argument, in the fact that, well, why is it that we are, in fact, seem to be aligned towards these? My moral conscience is aligned towards the good values, and not against the bad. Why isn't it a mixture? Like, why don't we value lying and not value rape? We value, I don't know, murdering every Tuesday, but not every Wednesday. Like there's, it seems we're aligned toward the quote unquote moral point of view. And that suggests there was an intelligent designer who designed our moral consciences to be in attune with those values, so to speak. So those would be the three arguments I would give to favor the theistic or person as the cause for these moral.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, so that's a sort of it towards grounding it in God, and you also would say that this morality is objective, right?
For sure.
Yeah. If it's objective, in what sense is it objective?
Well, it's an objective fact. It's an objective part of God. God's nature is it consists of following these moral principles, and he also issues forth the moral duties in the form of commands that don't apply to him, but these duties are derived from and are consistent with the overall moral principles that make up God's morally perfect nature.
Okay, so there it sounded like the is-ought issue was coming out. When you say it is a fact that God has this certain type of nature, I would ask immediately, of course, well, how do I go from it is the fact that God has any particular nature you want to name, loving or wise or otherwise, to the ought that you derive from that? There's still that gap. Now, it sounded like as many theists tend to do, is that you or many theists anyways, plug into the nature of God, that God is the good, his nature is a good, which just to me just completely question begs. It just sort of shuts. Oh yeah, it's the good. So therefore we ought to do it. But that's sort of just question begging is why we should accept God's nature, whatever it happens to be, as being the good. Now you actually mentioned that you think certain good properties are logically necessary, and that seems to be going towards trying to answer that question, but that will also, I think, bring in a Euthyphro type dilemma that you'd have to deal with, where God must be a certain way in order to be good, which seems to suggest a standard that God must measure up to. Referring it up to you.
Yeah. So with regards to the first option, so yeah, God's nature defines the good. It doesn't elicit a Euthyphro dilemma. Like I heard one philosopher, an atheist philosopher, going on about this, and he says, "Oh well, really, theists are just kicking down the can because, okay, God's nature, God's nature is necessarily good, but you can still ask, well, is it good because God creates it good, or because, or the other horn, because there's this outside standard. That's missing the point. It's saying God's nature defines the good. It is numerically identical to the good. Well, not as a subset of God. He's not just the good, but and that ends the regress. That ends the answer. Just as if you adopt an atheistic moral Platonism, I could answer, well, what makes the good the good? It's just a nonsense question. It just, the good defines the good.
Yes, but you're defining it in exactly the trivial way that I mentioned earlier. G. Moore would object to. Is G? I think it's G. Moore. You're defining the good in a trivial way that's susceptible to anybody defining the good that way. So if I define the good as being Vaal's nature, the buck stops there. So in other words, this is where reason comes in. You're making a proposal, and I'm going to ask, what are the reasons for me to accept the proposal? If you're defining God's nature as the good, what reason do I have to accept it? You're going to have to make an argument for why I ought to accept that. It just can't sit as being defined as the good, because then that becomes too trivial, and anybody can do that, and it results in contradictions all over the place.
So this is where I would say, no, you're wrong. I could, but no, I don't. In the context of answering or providing a defeater for the Euthyphro dilemma, this is where the atheist is making a claim and saying there are only two options. I only have to say, no, what about this? Here's a third option. You, Mr. Atheist, have to prove that there isn't that third option and that there are only these two problematic horns to take. So in that context, I don't.
I just did that, though. I just did exactly what you're asking. So the two horns of the Euthyphro that are problematic for the theist is that either it makes morality arbitrary. I'm just drawing a blank on the Euthyphro for a second. Either something is good because God commands it, or God commands it because it is good. So the problem is, if something is good, if God commands something because it's good, that means there are moral reasons God has for commanding it. That means that the moral reasons are external to God, and theists don't want that. But if something is good because God commands it, that seems to make morality arbitrary. You're saying that you have found a third way in between that. It's based on God's nature. God's nature is the good, but you need, it just moves kicks the can down. It does to the question of why is God's nature the good? Why should I accept that proposition? Because unless you have an answer to that, then you have left it open as being trivial, in the same way as I can solve morality as saying the good is that it derives from me, Vaal. So you have left it on an arbitrary horn insofar you haven't justified it.
Yeah, no. So
you're not allowing us to decide between good being based on God's nature, as you claim, and good being based on my nature or Donald Trump's nature.
Well, so I did.
So it's arbitrary.
In the first place, that could be a fourth horn. It would be on the atheist in the context of claiming the Euthyphro dilemma to prove that your nature wouldn't be an adequate ground, whereas God's would, right?
Exactly. So you need to prove that God's nature grounds morality.
Okay. So no, I just disagree. It's if I'm the one claiming the Euthyphro dilemma and you are not, and you go to me, well, those two horns aren't necessarily the case. There's potentially 4 or 100 horns, because maybe it's grounded in Val's nature, or David Johnson's nature, or God's nature, or Dale's nature. You've given a whole bunch of horns there. Me as the claimant, and you're just providing these potential defeaters. You don't have to do anything. I think that I need to go in and say, the David Johnson thesis is stupid. He's a human. He can't provide an adequate foundation. Same with Vaal, same with Dale. But God, oh, that's different because he's a logically necessary being. He can provide an adequate, potentially provide an adequate base. So then it's again, it's on the atheist to say, well, no, that God's nature wouldn't do it as well. And as I said, the logically necessary nature does handle that. That there's also why we need to follow, because that teleos version, the virtue ethics, right, where God creates the morals. Sorry, where we follow the God's nature to achieve certain ends or certain consequences. That's an aspect to why we follow the moral rules as well, in addition to it just being good for goodness sake to be like God.
Okay, so I was trying to follow your objection to my saying that you've left it arbitrary. And if I understood, what you seem to be saying is that the Euthyphro dilemma, which I raised, which I should say that I only raised in service of pointing out the general problem of morality being arbitrary or not, or objective, and basing it, and the general problems of basing it on a God. And that Euthyphro dilemma does posit those two horns, and it sounds like you're saying, right, no, if I start talking about God's nature, then I have sort of avoided those two horns.
Yeah.
But we might be able to say, you haven't avoided the general problem that the Euthyphro is pointing towards, which is what happens when you base morality on God. Can you defend that it is objective, or that it ends up being arbitrary? What happens when you base it on God? And the same type of concerns, the same species of concerns keep arising. So technically, it doesn't matter if it's precisely the Euthyphro dilemma that you have solved or not. You still, insofar as you still end up by basing on God's nature with the arbitrariness problem or emptiness problems, you've still got the type of problem that we're trying to get at. And so now and you're right, that if you can make an argument for why we ought to think morality is based on God's nature by, for instance, another argument, an ontological argument about God's necessary nature, well then, yeah, that's great. I'd just say go for it. It's one of those arguments that we should look at. But it sounded like you were saying it's just good enough for you to have defined God's nature as the good, and that won't fly. That's what I'm saying.
Let me turn it. Let me ask you a question then. So forget about God in this equation. Let's pretend I take one of the two horns, that there is this external standard, the good. These moral principles just exist in some kind of abstract way. What if I turn around and ask you, well, what makes the good good? Why is the principle of justice good? Is the principle arbitrarily defining that, hey, I'm a good principle, and the injustice saying, hey, I'm a bad one? Or is it appealing to some higher authority to say, well, justice is good versus that? And then I can just ad infinitum and say, well, what makes that standard, kind of thing. So what is it that makes the good good in your view?
Yeah, so that comes down to a moral theory, right? All different moral theories, of course, will come to different answers, but I will start gesturing towards it by something that kind of deals with an objection I'm currently having with the direction you're going. So, keeping in mind the universalizing character of reason, let's just take a sidestep from morality to the example of purpose. Does purpose exist? What is a purpose? How could it, if it exists, how could it arise? What does it take to arise if it exists? And how would God have to have these qualities? That kind of stuff. So, in order to, if you think about it, we're reasoning from, for instance, from experience to start with. And we already have an understanding of purpose, how purposes arrive. And I'll put it in like Kant's hypothetical imperative or prudential sort of imperatives, that kind of stuff. In other words, what's the purpose of me going to the fridge Well, I've got a purpose because I know there's some beer in there and I'm thirsty and I want to drink the milk. That is a cognitivist theory. I don't go for non-cognitivism. I think we're both on that same thing. So I'm kind of speaking as a cognitivist theory. So it is my belief that there is beer in the fridge and my desire to get beer and my reasons that in order to get the beer, I have to go up and I'll find it in the fridge. So that explains the purpose of me getting up and going to the fridge. Likewise, what's the purpose of this screwdriver? You can say you'll be talking about it purpose in terms of some goal that an agent has. You know, you're trying to you want to hold together some new IKEA shelf that you got. It takes Phillips screws. And so your purpose in looking for your Phillips screwdriver is that it will fulfill the goal of screwing in the Phillips screws that'll hold your new cabinet together. So we all have this understanding of how purpose arises from the beliefs and desires and goals of agents like ourselves. So now when theists even start reasoning about purpose in the universe and what could give us purpose, what could give the universe purpose, you have to note that they are reasoning in this way. So if there was just at the beginning of the universe, there was just like a rock, right? A non-sentient rock, and it just simply had the quality of causing universes, however that is, supernaturally or whatever. No theist or anybody would really accept that as saying, well, the universe had a purpose. It came from the rock. It just sort of came from the rock. It would be the same as if you're attributing it to like a scientific theory. For instance, like a quantum fluctuation and quantum foam, and it just the universe popped out of that. Theists wouldn't accept that as giving the universe having a purpose, or that it has given us our existence purpose, all that kind of stuff. So what do they do? What do they look for? They look for a person. They look for an agent. And it's got to be an agent who, from our experience of how purpose arises, an agent with sort of rationality, sort of desires or goals, rationality and ability to act on his reasons, and who wanted or desired or had the goal of creating the universe, and then reasoned that doing this, speaking into existence, whatever, would create the universe, and that gave the reason for him to create the universe, and therefore the reason that there was a purpose that for which the universe arose. It arose from the combination of desires and beliefs and rationality of a person. But the thing to note about that is that the very attributes that a God has to have in order to have a purpose at all, in order to give anything purpose, are the attributes that we ourselves already have. We are already beings who have desires and goals and who can reason about which actions are more likely to achieve those goals or desires. And reason being universalizable means that you can't special plead. You can't say, well, it takes this type of agent for purpose and reason to arise who created the universe, but then our reasons and purposes, they don't really count as much. They're wholly different. His are objective. Ours either just wouldn't even exist if he didn't exist, or ours just aren't objective. That's just special pleading. So I think this is essentially, to me, that the fatal problem with any attempt I've ever seen to found morality on God is morality is going to have the same things. To make sense of morality, of sort of what people ought to do or not, you're going to have to posit first of all, beings that have essentially characteristics we have. And you're going to have to posit a God who has personal characteristics that we already have in order to even make sense of founding it on God. That means that God isn't necessary, isn't the necessary ground morality. He's not necessary for morality.
Okay. Yeah. So it would respond two ways. So the first thing is this isn't going to address your necessary point, but the first thing is I could say contingently there's a difference with God, so we're not special pleading, given ignoring his attribute of necessity for the moment. He's got moral perfection. He's omniscient. He's omnipotent, and these sorts of things. So in a way, we can appeal to him as a moral authority. He would know better about the ends or the purposes that we want to achieve better than ourselves as rationally. Sorry?
I agree.
Yeah. So that would be a reason to privilege. Well, why am I going to listen to God as opposed to me, even though I have the same ingredients as him? Well, he has them to a better degree that makes him more of an authority. And then the second aspect is the fact, well, God is a logically necessary being, and if I can prove that moral truths, as I believe, are in fact logically necessary, they would require a necessary being or beings to ground them in. They couldn't be grounded in contingent beings like us. So that would be how I would get to God from those objections.
Yeah, well, I agree that if there is a God who consists of moral perfections, then it makes sense for us to listen to that God's moral recommendations. Now, the two things about that is, number one, it's an epistemic problem that since we're not omniscient, all of our evaluations are always going to be provisional, and so we could be wrong that any particular being is God. You know what I mean? So there's that, but there's also the problem of that I think you're going to get to, which is when we talk about God possessing all, like say, composable virtues. It's still the question still is: are they virtues because God possesses them, or is God virtuous because those virtues are virtuous? And so, if they are virtuous and God must have them because they're virtuous, then you still kind of get this independence from God.
Gotcha. Yeah. So it's again, Euthyphro dilemma type thing with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And now if you want to sort of make a stab at the like ontological argument, or your argument about certain moral properties, I guess it was, being logically necessary, do you want to try putting that together?
So yeah, like how would we establish that moral truths are logically necessary? Well, I gave in my opening presentation, I did give reasons to think that that moral absolutes or morals are objective, and these hint at necessary. I'm just trying to.
Was this one based on intuitions, partially?
That's one of them. Yeah. Geez, where is it? Okay, I can't find it. Oh, 3 strategies. Okay, so yeah. First of all, yeah, that is my primary way. Is I know that these moral truths, certain moral principles, and that are logically necessary in this properly basic way, and this is something that's really strong for me. That doesn't mean I have everything figured out, right? I sometimes on the question of, well, what exactly is entailed, what qualifications are, and I've kind of admitted, well, in the principle of truth, is there a qualification or not, and divine revelation has played a role in that. So I don't have all the details ironed out, but I do have it ironed out that there are these moral principles in general, regardless of the qualifications, and they are logically necessary in this properly basic way. And for nothing you will be able to say will convert me out of that, short of giving me proof, 100% knowledge that that they're not logically necessary in this way, in which case logical law of non-contradiction is broken, and I don't know how to live life. But the other thing is appeal to to a outside worldview. It possibly through like an ontological argument or something like that, we can prove that in the same way as proving, well, if God exists, that objective morals will exist. You could make a similar type thing and say logically necessary morals could exist. Falsifying relativism won't get, that'll just get you objectivism. But you could to try and help with the probably based beliefs, we could reflect on what does it mean for something to be what do we mean by moral truths? What are their nature? And as we said, well, they're universalizable. And how does that operate in modal logic then? Do these principles apply not just in our actual world, but across possible worlds? And you could say, well, that kind of hints that they're logically necessary. At the very least, they exist in multiple possible worlds and that sort of thing. And yeah, so that's how I would get the logically necessary bit. If it's not in a properly basic way, I'd probably try to come up with some way, well, based on the nature of what we know about morality and its application modally across possible worlds, this could possibly somehow get us to say that's proof that they're logically necessary. But yeah, in my preparation, I was mostly just focusing on objective versus subjective. So I haven't prepared
okay.
an argument there, but yeah,
that's fine. Then I'm not going to push too hard on that. I didn't really hear because I'm always going to be looking for a reason to accept your premises or propositions, and I didn't really hear the argument in there for why I should think of any particular moral rule as logically necessary. It sounded like you were gesturing towards a intuition or probably basic belief justification, which, as you know, I don't really accept, and I'm but I don't think we'll go down that rabbit hole at the moment. I'm still.
Can you, sorry to interrupt, but can you, using your modal evaluating faculties, conceive of a possible world where there's an exception? So not an exemption, but there's an actual exception. And remember, you agreed at the beginning of the show that the morals are universalizable, which means they're exceptionless. That the principles can't just be done away with. So that would hint that to you there is no logically possible world where an exception to the principles apply. There may be exemptions, right? So like lying to save a life, that's an exemption, but the principle still holds. It's still true in that world.
Oh no, I agree with that. I agree with that, but it's conditional. It's that if we're talking about an established moral rule, insofar as it's going to be derived from reason to a significant effect, everything that you said follows. But the whole point is actually accepting any particular moral rule as established in that way, and so I'm not ready to do that. I'm ready to be wrong or be shown wrong, I guess, about any particular moral rule, and so I don't think you've established them as being objectively true. I mean, like, I might agree with you on certain moral rules, but my agreeing doesn't establish them on my account as being objectively true. I would want a richer argument before accepting that. So yeah, once you've established it, there's going to be no logical exceptions in the alternative worlds. But that's what I was trying to get at.
All right, cool. So that's good, then that's progress. So on condition that I can establish just one moral principle, and you'd be like, yep, that's an objective fact, or moral rule, then I can get you to say, well, therefore they're logically necessary through that modal argument. It's just a matter of establishing to you that there is in fact one moral principle or rule that applies. And yeah, most of the time, like William and Craig, all they'll do is appeal to properly basic beliefs or your moral intuitions and say, well, don't you think that there is this principle of justice or principle of truth? Or I could falsify moral relativism. That, again, if my goal is two steps to get you to believe that in moral objectivism with these moral rules, once I get you to that, then I've already accomplished step two of getting you to say, well, they're logically necessary then. So it's just a matter of
it's a matter of providing the argument. But as I was saying, if I was for the instance of the problem I have with arguments that keep trying to base it on God's nature is I go back to the example of purpose. If you go back to for the idea of trying to say the universe has purpose if it came from a magic rock, you can add on more qualities as long as you keep it a non-personal, non-sentient entity like a rock. You can start adding on qualities like, okay, this rock is eternal. But that doesn't seem to give us purpose. Or this rock is all powerful, in that almost anything can arise. Anything logically possible can arise from it, supernaturally. That too doesn't seem to give us purpose. It still doesn't have. These are just incidental to what has to exist ontologically in order for purpose to exist, and that's what I get when people try and base purpose and or morality on God. It seems to me that God just has to have essentially the personal qualities that we do, which points towards promise that if we're going to find any universal principles, we'll find it in our own nature. And then all the other stuff larded onto God about him being all powerful or all knowing or all these other kind of things. They're just incidental. They don't do anything more to the whole project. And then of course, you can bring it back to trying to argue for God's necessary morality. But then, as I say, I just think euthypro type problems keep arising when you do that. Like, is God the greatest, the being of the greatest possible good qualities? Because good qualities exist and God is the greatest example of those qualities. In that case, once again, if we even know what we're talking about, then we already can apprehend those qualities, whether God exists or not. But are those qualities good because God's nature happens to be those qualities? Well, then we're on the arbitrary horn, and we're also into the epistemic problem, where you can say, well, if it's based on God's nature, how do we know what is right and right and wrong? If it would have to be from God revealing it to us. You might say God has revealed it to us even in our hearts, all that kind of stuff like that. But how do you know, for instance, the qualities that God has aren't that of being a deceiver or a sadist or all that kind of stuff? The only way you can really say that, object to that, seems to me to have an outside standard that God has to measure up to in order to be this good being. He has to be a truth teller. He has to be this or that, which once again posits this outside standard, which insofar as we can even apprehend of what you're talking about, we're talking about good, then it's something we as rational beings can already apprehend. And so long as we exist to apprehend those reasons, God doesn't need to exist. And it's just, there's no reason to posit that it is ontologically established on God's nature.
Okay, so I'm just going to focus on one thing that you said. So this is part of why theists, a lot of theists, even classically speaking, adopt some kind of combination of virtue ethics and deontology. So what would you make if you're I know you're not a virtue ethicist necessarily, but you are talking about this purpose, and that's all that's needed. We don't necessarily need these moral rules. So if I wanted to come up with an argument to try and get you to say, well, there is a need for moral rules. There must be at least one or more rules. And the main argument against just a pure virtue ethicist type view, as well as utilitarianism of any sort, is that it's inadequate or it's impractical to provide moral guidance. Where's that? Okay, I can't find the quote. I had a quote. I was going to sound smart, but it's gone now. But this is one of the main objections against just a pure virtue ethicist without any deontological contribution at all, or utilitarian. Yes. It's practical. It's impractical for solving moral dilemmas or specific morals and that sort of thing. You need to have all of these long-range consequences worked out and understand what's in place. It's the moral rules that give us the content of, okay, here as a virtue ethicist, here are the rules by which I form the right character. As a utilitarian, here are the rules that provide me the guidance to get those long-range beneficial consequences. Without it, you're just sort of blind. Is what
yeah.
Quote. Yeah. So how would you? Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that makes sense to me. Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's sort of like it kind of reminds me of how when people who liked Kant's theory or some form of deontology, and for instance, seem to account for not using other people as ends, etc. There seems to be a sense of justice built right into that is missing from bare utilitarian theories, in which even innocent people, in principle, could be used to some other end, some other consequentialist end. So that doesn't feel good. So you go to deontology, and that's got some seems like natural rules built in for not using other people as ends, which tends to invoke justice and other things that sort of feel good. And then, but then that starts to seem to clash once you get to the whole hiding a Jewish person from the Nazis type scenarios, which seem problematic, and other things which deontology seems to have a problem with. And so then they sort of moved to like a rule utilitarianism, where you are saying there are rules that you always follow, and you follow them, but they are the two differences are that the rules are selected for their utility, for instance, maximizing happiness, and also within the rules contain the exceptions necessary to get them out of the problems that just the regular deontology has. So, like, a rule, utilitarianism may have a rule like in any situation, A, treat as mere means as few people as possible, and B, treat as ends as many people as is consistent with A. So you've got exceptions. It's a rule that you will always follow, but there are exceptions built into the rule where you can save the Jewish person, that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I have a sneaky suspicion that we should probably start wrapping up at this point. I'm just mind reading, David Johnson on his end. I don't know. I'm just like that. But no. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. There were some. See, this is such a fascinating subject. There's so much there. I had a lot of questions we didn't even have time to get into. So I want to say thank you. This was a great conversation to both Val and David for inviting me on, and yeah, hopefully sometime in the future we can do other shows.
Okay, yeah, it's been great, Dale. And first of all, I'm really sorry we didn't get to the theory I was going to talk about, which basically wraps all these questions and tries to essentially answer them, and which would have been fun to have you poke holes in. So I'm sorry. I think it ended up me sort of pushing on your theories more than you on mine. So sorry we didn't get there. Probably as much as my fault as anything.
So I also am sorry for nothing. This has been an excellent discussion, and the only thing that would make it better is 3 more hours. But that's not the order of the day. And so,
So you know, Val, I got a little note from David, so that's why I wrapped it up.
No problem. No problem.
I had a feeling that if the voice from above did not step in, this conversation would never end. And it is my goal. It is my goal as a platform owner that this conversation never end. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it to the people, and I'm sure that you and you two will continue this discussion online. Hopefully, the two of you will make yourself available for shows in season 3 of Skeptics and Seekers. So that would be a lot of fun. I think people have been waiting for this discussion for a while at this level, and so I believe that we have delivered the first dose of that. Next week, we are going to be. I say next week. I'm sorry. Within the next couple of days, it will be myself and David Russell. He's a voice that you've heard on the channel quite a bit, and we're going to be picking up where these two left off. Our conversation will be slightly lower brow because we don't have brows that go up that high, but I think it'll still be an interesting discussion, rooted largely in the philosophy of how we know what the right thing to do is in any given situation. And so I can't wait to hear David's take, as I don't actually know what it is. And in the meantime, just watch every few days for shows coming out. They'll accelerate. The pace will accelerate as we hit the weekend, and continue to comment in the appropriate comment spots. And so with that all said and done, I think that we are all said and done. Thank you, two gentlemen, and we'll see the audience in the comments.
All right. Have a great week. And great talking to you there, Val. I hope to do it again soon.
Likewise. I really enjoyed it, Dale. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk with you and with David. It's lots of fun.
Awesome.